The dust never settled in Dodge City. It hung in the air like the ghosts of men who died with their boots on, swirling around the weathered buildings that lined Front Street. Jack Hollins sat on the porch of Murphy's saloon, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from Gettysburg that he'd carried for 23 years. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." At 43, Jack had the look of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. His steel-gray eyes rarely met anyone's gaze directly, and when they did, most folks found reason to look elsewhere. The twin Colt .45s on his hips weren't for show. Everyone in Dodge knew that much. He drifted into town 3 months ago, took a room above the barber shop, and kept to himself. Some said he was running from something. Others whispered he was hunting someone. Jack never bothered to correct either story. The stagecoach from Wichita was running late again. Jack could hear the rumble of wheels and the thunder of hooves before he saw the dust cloud rising on the horizon. Driver Pete Kowalski was pushing those horses hard, too hard for a routine run. Something was wrong. "Easy there, Pete," called out Sheriff Tom Bradley as the stage careened around the corner onto Front Street, nearly clipping the hitching post outside the general store. The horses were lathered with sweat, their eyes wild with exhaustion. Jack stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun belt. Years of survival had taught him to read trouble in the wind, and right now the wind was howling. Pete jumped down from the driver's seat, his face pale beneath his dusty hat. "Sheriff, we got problems. Real problems." "What kind of problems?" Bradley asked, his own hand moving to his badge as if touching it would give him strength. "Found her about 10 miles out," Pete said, jerking his thumb toward the stage. "Little girl, couldn't be more than 7 or 8, just standing in the middle of the trail like she was waiting for us." Jack's eyes narrowed. A child alone on the prairie was either lost or running from something. In his experience, it was usually the latter. The stage door creaked open, and a small figure emerged. The girl was tiny, with tangled brown hair that caught the dying sunlight and clothes that had seen better days, much better days. Her dress, once probably blue, was now the color of dust and tears. But it was her eyes that stopped Jack cold. They were the deepest green he'd ever seen, and they held a wisdom that no child should possess. She looked around the gathering crowd with the wariness of a cornered animal, her small hands clutching something against her chest. When her gaze fell on Jack, she froze. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stared at each other across the dusty street. "What's your name, little one?" Sheriff Bradley asked, kneeling down to her level. His voice was gentle, but the girl didn't take her eyes off Jack. "Emma," she whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear. "Emma Rose. Where are your folks, Emma Rose?" Bradley continued. "Your mama and papa?" The girl's lower lip trembled, and for the first time, she looked away from Jack. They're gone." "Gone where, sweetheart?" "Just gone." Her voice broke on the words, and Jack felt something twist in his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, stepped forward with her arms outstretched. "Come here, child. You must be hungry and scared." But Emma Rose shook her head and took a step backward, bumping into the stage wheel. Her eyes found Jack again, and she began walking toward him with deliberate, measured steps. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, everyone watching in stunned silence as the little girl approached the most feared man in Dodge City. Jack felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Children usually ran from him, not toward him. His reputation preceded him everywhere he went, and that reputation didn't include being good with kids. Emma Rose stopped directly in front of him, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, Jack could see the tear tracks on her dirty cheeks and the way her small body trembled with exhaustion and fear. She was holding a silver locket, its chain tangled around her fingers. "Mister?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the silent street. "Can you be my daddy?" The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the saloon post. The crowd gasped collectively, and he could hear Mrs. Henderson's sharp intake of breath. What?" Jack's voice came out as a croak. Emma Rose stepped closer, her green eyes never leaving his face. "I've been looking for someone strong, someone who won't let the bad men hurt me. You look strong." "Child, I'm not—" Jack started, but the words died in his throat. There was something in her eyes, something desperate and hopeful and heartbreaking all at once. "Please," Emma Rose whispered, and Jack could see her fighting back tears. "I don't have anybody else." Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "Now, Jack, we need to figure out where this little girl belongs. Can't just—" "I belong with him," Emma Rose interrupted, her voice stronger now. She reached out and took Jack's calloused hand in her tiny one. "He's going to protect me." Jack looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers small and soft despite the dirt. He'd killed men with these hands. He'd built walls around his heart so high that nothing could climb over them. But this little girl, with her impossible request and her unwavering faith, was asking him to tear those walls down. "Emma Rose," he said carefully, "you don't know anything about me." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "I know enough. I know you're going to say yes." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jack Hollins found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face. Behind him lay a lifetime of solitude and regret. Ahead of him stood a little girl who believed he could be something he'd never thought possible. The question that would haunt him through the long night ahead wasn't whether he could protect her, it was whether he could protect himself from the hope she'd awakened in his heart. Jack's room above the barber shop had never felt smaller. Emma Rose sat on the edge of his narrow bed, her legs swinging freely as she clutched the silver locket to her chest. The lamplight flickered across her face, casting dancing shadows that made her look even younger than her 8 years. "You hungry?" Jack asked, hovering near the door like a man afraid to enter his own space. He'd faced down armed desperados without breaking a sweat, but one little girl had him more nervous than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Emma Rose nodded, but her attention was focused on the locket. Her small fingers worked at the clasp with the determination of someone who'd tried this many times before. "It's stuck," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "It's been stuck for days." Jack hesitated, then moved closer. "May I?" She held out the locket without question, and Jack was struck again by her implicit trust in him. The silver was tarnished but well made, with intricate engravings around the edges. As he examined the clasp, he noticed something odd, tiny scratches around the mechanism, as if someone had deliberately damaged it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, working carefully at the stubborn clasp. "Mama gave it to me before—" Emma Rose's voice trailed off. "Before the bad men came." Jack's hands stilled. "What bad men?" "The ones with the red bandanas. They came to our house in the middle of the night. Mama hid me in the root cellar and gave me this. She said if anything happened, I should find the man in the picture and give it to him." "What picture?" Emma Rose pointed to the locket. "Inside. Mama said he would keep me safe." With a soft click, the clasp finally gave way. Jack opened the locket carefully, and his breath caught in his throat. On one side was a small photograph of a woman with Emma Rose's green eyes and gentle smile. But it was the other side that made his blood run cold. Staring back at him was his own face, 20 years younger, clean-shaven, and wearing a Union Army uniform. It was a photograph he'd given to someone long ago, someone he'd thought was lost forever. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You knew my mama?" Emma Rose asked, her eyes wide with hope. Jack sank into the room's only chair, the locket trembling in his hands. Sarah Mitchell, the woman he'd loved and lost during the war, the woman who'd disappeared one night without a word, leaving only a letter saying she couldn't wait for a man who might never come home. We were... Jack struggled to find words that would make sense to a child. I knew her a long time ago. She told me stories about you, Emma Rose said, scooting closer to the edge of the bed. She said you were the bravest man she ever knew. She said you saved people. Jack let out a bitter laugh. I'm not brave, little one, and I haven't saved anyone in a very long time. But you'll save me, won't you? Before Jack could answer, the sound of boots on the stairs outside made him freeze. Heavy, deliberate steps. Too many of them. He moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtain. 4 men stood in the alley below, their faces hidden in shadow but their intent clear from the way they positioned themselves around the building. Emma Rose, Jack said quietly. I need you to hide under the bed. Right now. What's wrong? Just do as I say. His voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed in life or death situations. Emma Rose slipped under the bed without another word, and Jack was grateful for her quick understanding. He checked his guns, making sure both Colts were loaded and ready. The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. A soft knock came at the door, too polite for men with honest intentions. Jack Hollins, a voice called out. We'd like a word. Jack recognized the voice immediately. Caleb Morrison, leader of the Red Bandana Gang, the same gang Emma Rose had mentioned. Morrison was wanted in 3 territories for robbery, murder, and worse. If he was here, it meant Emma Rose was more valuable than Jack had realized. Doors open, Jack called back, positioning himself behind the overturned table he'd quickly moved for cover. The door creaked open, and Morrison stepped inside, followed by 3 of his men. They were exactly what Jack expected. Hard faces, harder eyes, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of taking what they wanted. Well, Morrison said, his voice smooth as snake oil. The famous Jack Hollins. Heard you were in town. Word travels fast, Jack replied, his hands resting casually on his gun butts. What do you want, Morrison? Now, that's not very neighborly. Can't old friends have a conversation? We were never friends. Morrison chuckled, but his eyes remained cold. True enough, but we do have something in common now. A certain little girl who's been causing us quite a bit of trouble. Don't know what you're talking about. Come now, Jack. The whole town saw her choose you as her protector. Touching scene, really. But the thing is, that little girl has something that belongs to us. She's just a child. She's the daughter of a woman who stole from us, Morrison snarled, his pleasant facade dropping away. Sarah Mitchell thought she could take our money and disappear, thought she could hide behind her new husband and his ranch. But we found her eventually. Jack's blood turned to ice. New husband? Oh, you didn't know? Morrison's smile was cruel. Sarah married a rancher named Thomas Rose about 7 years ago. Took his name, had his child. Well, supposedly his child. But we always wondered about those green eyes. Emma Rose's green eyes. Eyes that looked nothing like the photograph of Thomas Rose that Morrison pulled from his pocket, but everything like Jack's own. The timing was interesting, Morrison continued. 9 months after you and Sarah had your little reunion in Kansas City. You remember Kansas City, don't you, Jack? That night you thought no one would ever find out about? Jack's mind reeled. Kansas City, 8 years ago. He'd been tracking a bounty when he'd run into Sarah at a hotel. One night of old passion and older love, and then she'd disappeared again, just like before. He'd never known. Where is she? Jack asked, his voice deadly quiet. Dead, Morrison said simply. Along with her husband. They died protecting something that wasn't theirs to protect. But the girl got away with the locket, and inside that locket is information about where Sarah hid our money. What information? Morrison's eyes glittered with greed. Sarah was always clever. She encoded the location in that photograph of you. The scratches on the back, the way it's positioned in the locket. It's a map, Jack. A map to $50,000 in gold. Jack's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his gun. And you think I'm just going to hand her over? I think you're going to be smart about this. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting for a child who isn't even yours, officially speaking. She asked me to be her daddy, Jack said quietly. That makes her mine. Morrison's laugh was harsh. How touching. But sentiment doesn't stop bullets, Jack. Last chance. Give us the girl and the locket, and you can walk away from this." Jack looked at the overturned table where Emma Rose was hiding, then back at Morrison. In that moment, he realized something that shook him to his core. For the first time in 20 years, he had something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. "Morrison," Jack said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "You're going to have to go through me." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of guns being drawn and the whispered prayer of a little girl who believed her daddy would keep her safe. The first shot shattered the lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. Jack rolled behind his makeshift barricade as Morrison's men opened fire, their muzzle flashes lighting up the small space like deadly fireflies. Splinters exploded from the wooden table as bullets tore through it, and Jack could hear Emma Rose's muffled whimper from beneath the bed. "Stay down, sweetheart," Jack called out, then returned fire with both Colts. His first shot caught Morrison's man, Billy Creed, in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor. "Take him alive if you can," Morrison shouted from the doorway. "We need to know what he knows about the money." Jack's bitter laugh cut through the gunfire. "You want me alive? Come and get me." The room filled with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jack counted his shots carefully. He had maybe a dozen rounds left between both guns. Morrison had brought enough firepower to level the building, but the narrow doorway worked in Jack's favor. They couldn't all rush him at once. A shadow moved past the window, and Jack realized they were trying to flank him. He put 2 quick shots through the glass and heard a man cry out in pain as he fell from the fire escape. "Jack!" Sheriff Bradley's voice echoed from the street below. "What in tarnation is going on up there?" "Stay back, Tom," Jack shouted. "This isn't your fight." But even as he said it, Jack knew the sheriff wouldn't listen. Tom Bradley was a good man, but he was also stubborn as a mule and twice as brave. The sound of boots pounding up the stairs confirmed Jack's fears. "Morrison!" Bradley's voice boomed from the hallway. "This is Sheriff Bradley. You're surrounded." Morrison's laughter was cold as winter wind. "Sheriff, you're a bit outgunned here. Might want to rethink your position." The gunfire paused for a moment, and in that brief silence, Jack heard something that made his blood freeze. Emma Rose was crying. Not the quiet whimpers from before, but the heartbroken sobs of a child who'd seen too much violence in her short life. "It's okay, little one," Jack whispered, reloading as quickly as he could. "Daddy's here. Daddy's not going anywhere." The word felt strange on his lips, but also right in a way he'd never expected. Whether Emma Rose was his blood daughter or not didn't matter anymore. She'd chosen him, and he'd chosen her back. "Touching," Morrison called out. "But this ends now. Boys, burn them out." The smell of kerosene filled the air, and Jack's heart sank. They were going to torch the building. In minutes, the whole place would be an inferno, and Emma Rose. "Jack!" Sheriff Bradley appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn. "Get the girl and get out. I'll hold them off. Tom, no!" But Bradley was already moving, laying down covering fire as Morrison's men scattered. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. He dove under the bed, scooping Emma Rose into his arms. "Hold on tight," he told her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck without question. Jack kicked out the window and looked down at the fire escape. It was a 15-foot drop to the alley below, manageable for him. But with Emma Rose in his arms, it would be risky. Behind them, he could hear the crackle of flames beginning to spread. "Trust me," he whispered to Emma Rose, and leaped. They hit the ground hard, Jack rolling to absorb the impact and protect the child. Pain shot through his left shoulder, but nothing felt broken. Emma Rose was shaken but unhurt. "Run," Jack told her, pointing toward the stable at the end of the alley. "Hide in the hayloft and don't come out until I come for you." "What about you?" "I have to help the sheriff." Emma Rose's green eyes were wide with fear. "Promise you'll come back. Promise you won't leave me like everyone else did." Jack cupped her face in his hands, seeing Sarah's features reflected in her daughter's face. His daughter's face. "I promise, Emma Rose, I will never leave you, never." She nodded and ran toward the stable, her small figure disappearing into the shadows. Jack turned back to the burning building, where gunfire still echoed from the upper floor. He took the back stairs 3 at a time, his guns ready. The hallway was thick with smoke, and he could see flames licking at the walls. Sheriff Bradley was pinned down behind an overturned dresser, blood seeping from a wound in his leg. "Told you to get out of here!" Bradley shouted over the gunfire. "Never was good at following orders," Jack replied, putting 2 shots into Morrison's remaining men. One went down immediately, the other ducked back into Jack's room. "Where's Morrison?" Jack asked. "Went after the girl," Bradley said, trying to stand on his wounded leg. "Soon as he saw you jump with her." Jack's blood turned to ice. Emma Rose. He'd sent her right into Morrison's hands. "Can you make it out?" Jack asked the sheriff. "Go," Bradley said, waving him away. "Save that little girl." Jack ran through the smoke-filled hallway and down the back stairs, his heart pounding with more than just exertion. If Morrison hurt Emma Rose, if he was too late. The stable was eerily quiet when Jack reached it. Too quiet. He moved carefully through the shadows, both guns drawn, listening for any sound that might tell him where they were. "Looking for something, Jack?" Morrison's voice came from the hayloft above. Jack looked up to see the outlaw holding Emma Rose in front of him like a shield, a knife pressed to her throat. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she wasn't crying. She was being brave for him. "Let her go, Morrison," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between you and me." "Oh, but she's the key to everything, isn't she?" Morrison's smile was visible even in the dim light. "Sarah's little secret. Your little secret. The location of our money is encoded in that locket, and this sweet child is going to help us decode it. The money's not worth dying for. Maybe not, but revenge is." Morrison's eyes glittered with madness. "Sarah cost me everything when she ran off with our gold. My men, my reputation, my standing with the other gangs. I've spent 2 years tracking her down, and I'm not leaving empty-handed." Jack calculated the distance, the angle, the risk. 1 shot, that's all he'd get. If he missed, if Morrison's hand slipped. "You know what the funny thing is?" Morrison continued. "Sarah never told you about the child because she wasn't sure. Could have been yours, could have been Thomas Rose's. But looking at her now, seeing those eyes," he laughed. "No doubt about it, is there?" Emma Rose looked down at Jack, and in that moment he saw something that broke his heart and filled it at the same time. She wasn't looking at him with fear or desperation. She was looking at him with absolute faith. She believed he would save her, believed it with every fiber of her being. "Daddy," she whispered, and the word gave Jack the strength he needed. In one fluid motion, Jack drew and fired. The bullet caught Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and away from Emma Rose. She fell into the hay as Morrison tumbled from the loft, landing hard on the stable floor. Jack was beside Emma Rose in seconds, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then threw her arms around his neck. "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't break your promise." Behind them, Morrison groaned and tried to reach for his fallen gun. Jack stood slowly, his own weapon trained on the wounded outlaw. "It's over, Morrison." But as sirens wailed in the distance and the flames from the barber shop lit up the night sky, Jack realized this was just the beginning. Emma Rose was safe, but questions remained. Questions about the money, about Sarah's past, and about the future he and his daughter would build together. The hardest battles, Jack knew, were often fought after the shooting stopped. 3 weeks later, Jack sat on the porch of the small house he'd rented on the outskirts of Dodge City, watching Emma Rose chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Her laughter carried on the evening breeze, a sound he'd never thought he'd hear from the terrified child who'd whispered, "Can you be my daddy?" in the middle of Front Street. The locket lay open on the table beside him, its secrets finally revealed. Sheriff Bradley had been right about the encoded information. Sarah had been clever, perhaps too clever for her own good. The scratches on the back of Jack's photograph, when aligned with the positioning in the locket, had indeed formed a crude map. But the treasure it led to wasn't Morrison's stolen gold. It was something far more valuable. "Jack?" Dr. Margaret Whitman approached from the garden gate, her medical bag in hand. She'd been checking on Emma Rose regularly since the incident, more out of concern for the child's emotional state than any physical injuries. "Evening, Doc," Jack said, standing respectfully. "She's doing better. Sleeping through the night now, most times." Dr. Whitman nodded, watching Emma Rose with professional interest. "Children are remarkably resilient, but trauma has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. How are you holding up?" Jack considered the question. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a man with no past worth remembering and no future worth planning. Now he was responsible for a little girl who called him daddy and meant it with every beat of her heart. "Learning," he said simply. "The adoption papers came through," Dr. Whitman said, pulling an envelope from her bag. "Judge Morrison, no relation to Caleb, thankfully, signed them this morning. Emma Rose Hollins is now officially your daughter." Jack took the papers with hands that trembled slightly. Emma Rose Hollins. It had a good sound to it. "There's something else," Dr. Whitman continued. "I received a telegram from Kansas City yesterday about Sarah Mitchell, or Sarah Rose as she was known there." Jack's attention sharpened. "What about her?" "She left a letter with a lawyer there to be opened only in the event of her death. It explains everything, Jack. About Emma Rose, about the money, about why she never told you." Dr. Whitman handed him a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Jack's name was written across the front in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "I'll leave you to read it in private," the doctor said, gathering her things. "But Jack, whatever it says, that little girl loves you. That's what matters now." After Dr. Whitman left, Jack sat holding the letter for a long time. Emma Rose had moved on from chasing fireflies to picking wildflowers, her small hands creating a bouquet that would probably wilt before morning, but would be treasured nonetheless. Finally, he opened the envelope. "My dearest Jack, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and Emma Rose has found you. I pray she's safe, and I pray you found it in your heart to love her as I know you're capable of loving. She is yours, Jack. I knew it from the moment she was born, but I was too afraid to tell you. Not afraid of you, but afraid of the life you led. You were always chasing ghosts, always fighting battles that weren't yours to fight. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you to violence, and I couldn't bear the thought of Emma Rose growing up without a father. Thomas Rose was a good man who loved us both, but he knew the truth. Emma Rose was never his biological daughter, though he raised her as his own. When the Morrison gang came looking for the money I'd hidden, Thomas died protecting us. I managed to get Emma Rose away, but I knew they'd never stop hunting us. The map in the locket doesn't lead to Morrison's gold, Jack. It leads to something I saved for Emma Rose's future, money I earned honestly, working as a seamstress in Kansas City. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give her a good life, an education, a chance to be more than we ever were. But more than money, I'm giving her you. I know you think you're not father material, but I've seen your heart. Jack Hollins, I've seen how you protect the innocent, how you fight for what's right even when it costs you everything. That's the man I want raising our daughter. Love her, Jack. Love her enough for both of us. And maybe, in loving her, you'll finally learn to forgive yourself for all the things you think you've done wrong. All my love, Sarah P.S. There's a music box in the cache where the money is hidden. Emma Rose loves music, just like her father used to. Jack wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring who might see. Sarah had known him better than he'd known himself. She'd seen past the guns and the scars to the man he could be, the man Emma Rose needed him to be. "Daddy?" Emma Rose appeared at his elbow, her bouquet of wildflowers clutched in her small hands. "Are you sad?" "No, sweetheart," Jack said, lifting her onto his lap. "I'm not sad. I'm grateful." "For what?" "For you. For this." He gestured at the house, the garden, the life they were building together. "For getting a second chance to be the man I always wanted to be." Emma Rose studied his face with those serious green eyes. "Mama used to say that families aren't just about blood. They're about choosing to love each other every day. Your mama was a smart woman. Are you going to choose to love me every day?" Jack hugged her close, breathing in the scent of wild flowers and childhood innocence. "Every day for the rest of my life, Emma Rose. That's a promise." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack thought about the cash Sarah had hidden, about the money that would secure Emma Rose's future, about the music box that would bring joy to her present. Tomorrow they'd follow the map together, father and daughter on an adventure that would be the first of many. But tonight, they were simply a family sitting on their porch, watching the world settle into peaceful darkness. Jack had spent most of his life running from his past, but Emma Rose had taught him something precious. Sometimes the best way to heal old wounds was to open your heart to new love. "Tell me a story, Daddy," Emma Rose said, settling more comfortably against his chest. "What kind of story?" "A happy one. About a cowboy who thought he'd always be alone but then found out he was wrong." Jack smiled, understanding that she was asking for their story. The story of how a whispered question in a dusty street had changed two lives forever. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a lonely cowboy who thought he'd never have a family. But then one day, a brave little girl asked him the most important question anyone had ever asked him." As Jack's voice carried into the night, weaving their tale of love found and family chosen, Emma Rose's eyes grew heavy with sleep. But she fought to stay awake, not wanting to miss a single word of the story that had made them both whole. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying other travelers to other destinations. But Jack Hollins was exactly where he belonged, home at last, with his daughter in his arms and their future stretching out before them like an endless sky full of stars. The lonely cowboy had found his family, and his family had found their forever home in each other's hearts. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.